we don't have a choice. We are people who cannot live in this world of white supremacy.
This is Max Rameau, strategist, theorist, author, and organizer with Pan-African Community Action, and you are listening to The Next World. On this show, we explore and celebrate the work of poor people's movements, particularly in the U.S. We highlight innovative and powerful organizing campaigns and community building led by women, LGBTQ folks, Black communities, and other people of color that are pushing the boundaries and have the potential to transform society. Today on the show, we talk to Njera Keith and Kristina Brown, the co-founders and Ministers of Cohesion of 401, a Black cooperative federation based in Texas. Together, we discuss revolutionary organizing, vanguardism, and gender politics in social movements. Quick programming note, Kristina Brown, one of the co-founders of 401, had to leave in the middle of our interview. So at the beginning of the interview, we'll have both of the founders together, but the latter part of the interview will only feature Njera. Okay, Njera Keith and Kristina Brown, welcome to The Next World. We know that both of you are co-founders of 401, but let's do a little step back. What was your path? What brought you to this kind of work in the first place? Each of you individually, and then how did that happen together?
My introduction to movement work really happened in my childhood. My dad is a lifelong organizer and identifies as a revolutionary. And I was homeschooled for a great deal of my childhood. And that homeschooling kind of focused on, it had a strong Black nationalist bent. I wasn't introduced into anti-capitalism or struggles around class or gender until later in my life, early adulthood. But that's kind of how I got started thinking about how I wanted to be in community, contribute to struggle, etc. I kind of started off dabbling in campus organizing and moved on to charity work and was kind of realizing step by step that this wasn't like deep enough for what I wanted to contribute. And so I founded an autonomy-focused organization in Austin, Black Sovereign Nation. And so Black Sovereign Nation focused on community gardening, community defense initiatives, the cadre, the main leadership collective within Black Sovereign Nation lived together in a co-op. We focused on independent press for the community. And so my thoughts and ideas at the time were just around base building and power building and how that actually happens, and kind of seeing survival programs and mutual aid as kind of interventions that could facilitate that kind of base building and power building. And that all happened within the context of Austin. And I discovered the kind of limitations of even mutual aid and survival programs and local organizing. I know that a lot of us emphasize local organizing and the power of it. And it is very powerful, but also in terms of scalability and sustainability and retention, there are some issues that I kind of ran into. And that's how Kristina and I ended up connecting.
Yeah. So my path was a little different, a little later on in life. So I was already in my undergrad degree, had gone to Baylor, moved to Austin for my grad degree at UT, and was experiencing how isolating and restrictive academia can be when you really have the heart of an organizer and you're wanting to prioritize a Black population or audience, right? And that pushed me into community organizing in Austin locally, getting involved with some groups, and then eventually founding my own group, Counterbalance ATX, around 2017. And this was really as consequence of a consequence of the police killings that were happening at that time. Seemed like that summer, pretty much every day, we were hearing about someone else who's dying. And that was really hard and really shook me, destabilized is really what I would term it now, to becoming more active in doing something and leveraging my privilege as someone who had gotten an education, was getting an education and things like that. Unfortunately, like a lot of people, I didn't have any type of context. I didn't have principles that I knew I should stick by. I didn't have, this is what my ancestors have done. Didn't have that historical background and didn't even understand quite like egotistically that is all necessary before you make the first step. So I started a organization thinking we would kind of understand that as a group, as a collective, and all I really needed to do was gather folks. So we really prioritized gathering Black identified women in Austin and wanting to leverage gathering as a tactic to eventually mobilize people for their political interests. I was also doing work at the state capitol, at the legislature, and around maternal mortality. Specifically, Texas has the worst maternal mortality rates in the United States in the developed world. Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die than their white counterparts while experiencing childbirth. So that was something, because I was getting my master's in epidemiology, really wanting to see where the intersection of white supremacy and the medical health complex, intersected, and seeing how people didn't have access to the resources they need, and seeing how implicit bias and just racism was continuing to determine the health outcomes for Black people as a whole. So that really pushed me into organizing, and Counterbalance became the context to do that in. And quite, soon, as Njera was saying with her experience, I began to see, okay, these are challenges that no one has a solution for: scalability, sustainability, how we're going to continue to make sure that this work goes on between just one person being, pushing until they can and then being burnt out. How do we see a economic infrastructure begin to form around some of these efforts? These are all things that I was grappling with at the time that I really became in community with Njera, and quite frankly, was asking her these questions, as she was the person who was leaning into autonomy, was leaning into mutual aid before everyone was doing mutual aid, leaning into how you can sustain organizers who are trying to do this full time before anybody was thinking about that. So she had already, developed a revolutionary schooling program. She had a school, autonomous school for Black children in Austin. She had a gardening program. Like she said, she had a cooperative. So she was really building out infrastructure in a way that I was not seeing, and really also pushing everyone in Austin to remain within the principal line of, this is what it means. If we're going to do this, we can't sell out. We can't interact with the police. We have to be anti-capitalist, all these things. And she was the person that I was kind of leaning to be like, okay, I don't know that anybody has a solution, but this is the person that I feel like is the closest. Let's, try to figure out something together. And that's kind of where the story 401 started.
Mm-hmm.
So this is fascinating, both in terms of the development, but also in the different paths that you took. So Njera, it seems like you started out with a lot more of the theory because of where you came from. And then as you implemented some parts of the theory, you recognized some of the limitations of those things in putting the theory into practice. And then by contrast, Kristina, you started out, it seems like you had more of an aha moment at some point, recognizing the police brutality and all these other things and all these other injustices. And you came into movement work based on your outrage or your anger. And then you started to recognize some of the limitations of that, and then how you needed to develop some theory around the action that you were taking. So first of all, it seems like it makes a great match in terms of someone who came in from action and someone who came in from theory, but also the ability to synthesize those two. I find really interesting, and I think we'll delve into that a little bit along. But just in terms of the context, the political context of where you are, you're in or near Austin, Texas, anyway, in Texas, but near Austin. When I think of Texas, in my mind's eye, I imagine a white guy eating bacon while holding his gun, while floating in a little boat that's on a lake of oil.
Oh my gosh.
That describes Texas. So can you give us a little on the political landscape of Texas there? I've been there a few times. I have a brother who lives there, but can you give us a little bit of political context of what's going on in Texas now, generally, and then what that means for organizing Black or African people?
Yeah, I think it's important to note that there are Texas organizers who are very grounded in Texas's issues and Texas's landscape specifically. Texas is more where we come from, but it's not necessarily our focus. So I just want to acknowledge that We're not being intentional about immersing ourselves solely in the politics of Texas. And so some of the nuance we may miss in a way that other organizers wouldn't. One of the things that we experienced, it's interesting that you talked about this.
And I'm sorry, and you're okay with that. Like you're saying we miss some of the nuance that they do, but you're not like, well, we need to catch up on the nuance. You're fine with that.
Yes, we're fine with the fact that we miss some of the nuance of Texas because we want to be diasporic focused. So like we want to focus on the African diaspora. We're Black nationalists and also Pan-Africanists. And so the movement theory that undergirds 401's praxis is one of synthesization and unity and cohesion, like you kind of alluded to earlier. And so we've, since our, Black sovereign nation and counterbalance roots, shifted away from hyper-local organizing or focusing on physical place in the same way that we used to, because of some of the limitations of focusing on physical place permanently. We don't mean like at all, or that local organizing isn't necessary, but rather we feel that ecological organizing is necessary and that we have to connect these local movements to one another. And so in this time of deep decentralization, of deep fragmentation, what kind of praxes are undergirding this or catalyzing this connectivity that 401 would like to see? So to answer your question, yes, we're okay with not being hyper-focused on Texas in this moment. And so to answer your question, we're going to speak more to what our experiences have been in Texas and less about what we would say the overall political climate is in Texas right now at this moment. Is that okay?
Sure, that's great.
Cool. So actually, when we founded 401, we wanted to compare the climate we were experiencing in Texas to the climate in other places, especially as radical Black organizers were experiencing it. So some of the things we were experiencing were regressivism, reactionary movement, a lot of compromising principles for funding, a lot of isolation of radical and revolutionary organizers in Texas because of the perceived danger of radicalism in a deeply conservative environment. Also, a kind of minimalization of the issues that Texas was facing by the more national movement for Black liberation and international movement for Black liberation. There wasn't a lot of talk about what was happening here, though, like Kristina mentioned earlier, this was kind of and is still kind of ground zero for a lot of the issues that we're trying to address in our movement. So those are things that we experienced. And then in branching out on the Beyond Tour in 2018, we're able to see that was pretty ubiquitous, like in our movement. Everybody was experiencing that. That wasn't specifically a Texas thing. So that was a part of our experience. One of the things we noticed was how Austin specifically positions itself as a progressive city, right? Before we got into the interview, we talked about the Keep Austin Weird movement and this cultural push to frame Austin as kind of like a Shangri-La for progressives, for liberals, right? And it is a Shangri-La for neoliberalism, right? And that is kind of what we see in Austin. We see this kind of capitulating or self-aggrandizement in terms of liberal or progressive values. And then at the same time, we were seeing that Austin had the 6th most brutal police force in the nation, right? At the same time, we see so many unhoused folks and so many of those folks Black, right? At the same time, we see the eroding and the erosion of Black cultural institutions in Austin and across Texas. One of the things we noticed is how difficult it was for Black organizations, Black cultural institutions to survive in Texas. So if you come across a Black Texas organization that's been that was founded 20 years ago, that's a rarity. That is a unicorn in our experience. So longevity.
Or it's really ineffective.
Right. Or
that's why they stay around.
Moving in alignment with exactly. Yeah. But if we're talking about radical organization and you've been around for 20 years, that's something, right? Like we all need to celebrate because it's very difficult to achieve that in Texas. So in terms of like some of the institutional issues, we actually staged a boycott of Austin Public Library back in 2019 because the policies that they had on the books were very criminalizing of Black youth. There was no policy against calling the police on a child, for example, or involving law enforcement when you're looking for a child's parents or you're wanting to help resource a child. The library and recreation centers and other public institutions like that were still really maintaining a close and intimate relationship with Austin Police Department. And that's something that we tried to disrupt. We did disrupt. Around the same time in 2019, we saw this rollout of anti-abortion ordinances in rural areas within Texas. So there was a strategy that the right was using to attack abortion's legal legitimacy by taking the issue to municipal governments. So I'm just going to take this ordinance to a city council and get the city council to approve an abortion ban in this city, in this small rural town. And it was a successful tactic that they were using. So we started trying to kind of canvass the local and rural towns that had higher Black populations to make sure that the, Black folks were being engaged around this issue. And we found that they really weren't, right? So there's a strong abortion movement in Texas that is neglectful of Black people, especially Black people in these conservative spaces. There's like a fear of going there and doing the work on the ground by big nonprofits and organizations outside of those spaces. I'm not trying to speak to what organizers do in those towns themselves, but in our experience, there was actually a lot of fear, a lot of violence that undergirded people's fear of organizing in those little local municipalities, rural municipalities.
Also, with our experience with the destabilization study in 2020, which we had a destabilization study, created a destabilization study rather, to understand what was happening with the uprisings in 2020. We started seeing, with the death of George Floyd, what was happening in Minneapolis, but we saw that spreading across the country. And we have a high prioritization for data gathering, fact finding. As Njera was saying, when we're canvassing in places like Wascom, Texas, we really want to prioritize the voices of the people who are in these spaces, the Black voices, the people who are most impacted. So we can, as people who identify as full-time professional revolutionaries, be able to understand what our material condition is using dialectical materialism, and then be able to form a strategy within our movement theory, right? So we subscribe to Orishan communism, which I'm sure we'll get into later, which is a specific way of practicing communism that allows us to align with our principles, which includes things like reproductive revolution, while also be able to accurately, or as accurately as we can, understand what our material is and respond to it. So we're still trying to build a vanguard, we're still building alternatives, and we are still destabilizing, but how can we do that within the context of what is happening in front of us? So we decided to do a destabilization study in 2020 to understand what was happening, what was causing people to divest, what was causing people to uprise, where was it happening, and who was it happening to? We were in Austin, we were in Minneapolis, we were in New York, and we had teams in each place coordinating and collecting surveys, while also, distributing bail fund for folks who were getting arrested in connection to the uprisings, as well as providing resources in terms of protection, shields, medical supplies, things like that for folks, especially here in Austin, that were being brutalized by the police. So through that, we were able to understand a little bit what you're asking. What is the material condition here in Austin, and how can we compare that to across the board? Because to your question earlier and what Njera was saying, we're not fixated on Texas because we understand through our experiences as young organizers with Black Sovereign Nation and Counterbalance that we are looking for an ecological response, as you mentioned. We are looking to unite under one banner. We're trying to find how we can be cohesive in ideology and also in impetus. How can we all share values, as that's been a huge challenge, and how can we all move at the same time, right? Not get in each other's way. And that is only possible if we come under one banner if we understand what folks are dealing with. So from the beginning, with the Beyond Tour, with the destabilization study, you see 401 making connections, prioritizing making those connections so that we can practice an ecological response. Here,
and when you're saying making those connections, you mean in an ideological sense. In other words, that there's a shared ideology, there's a shared way of shared tools of analysis that allows you to interpret history in general, but what's happening today in particular. And by shared, I mean, people can be in different rooms and still come to the same conclusions.
Yeah, and we believe we're looking to do that all within ourselves. So a lot of folks, and we're kind of getting off, but a lot of folks have done that in coalition, right? Folks create structures, people create connections with each other and try to do that, try to move at the same time by building relationship. And we've actually found that not to be super effective in our experiences with coalition work. And we're hoping that those connections can all be done under 401, which is kind of the structure that we have. We have a compartmentalized infrastructure so that any type of revolutionary, whether you're one who's wanting to focus on tactical work, charismatic leadership, or you're wanting to build alternatives, or you're wanting to be in a community, there's a space for you in 401, and we can all work together, all working economically together, principally together, so that we can move together and be most effective. And that's what we're doing. We're prioritizing some of the smaller details, or we're prioritizing, the macro picture for some of the smaller details so that we can begin to develop a Pan-Africa.
And when you, Kristina, when you talk about some of the limitations of coalitions, do you mean that you, as organizationally, 401 does not want to engage in coalitions, or that the coalitions are really limited in when and under what circumstances you engage them?
I mean, we are very sparingly willing to do that. And our experience, because even starting back with Counterbalance and BSN, we were in coalition together, separate organizations. And we saw that if you're not coming to the table saying this is what the line is, undoubtedly someone's going to be selling out. Undoubtedly someone's going to be willing to talk to the cops. Someone's going to be willing to take money. And that's exactly what we're seeing happening across our movement, just not here in Texas, but across the world, really. Right. So how can we stop getting tripped up as Black folks, as Africans, on how can we develop cohesion? Europeans have been able to do that when they decided to create a Black person, right? When they decided to construct racism and decided to organize us in this spectrum of priority, they were like, we're all agreeing to this. We have not yet, as Black folks, agreed on one thing, right? And decided to move together. So that's what we're deciding to do with 401. In terms of coalition work, that is internal. That's an internal process. We've moved that from trying to engage with folks who are doing, different work in different places while we're still in deep community with them, right? So we are in deep community with folks who are part of Hood Communists, who are part of BAP. Some of our members are even a part of BAP, but we're wanting—
BAP being Black Alliance for Peace, which is an international organization.
Yes, thank you. And wanting to make sure that we focus our energy, our capacity on doing that, again, ecologically, internally, because that's what we can control. We can't force anybody to do anything, but we can say, okay, hey, before you join 401, this is what we're agreeing to do, and this is how we're agreeing to do it, which is why we prioritize so much the macro, right? We have a movement theory. We have a movement for change. We have a strategy. We develop tactics very explicitly and intentionally so that we're not kind of just waiting in the water, deciding, as I was doing Counterbalance, like I'm going to gather the people first and then we'll make a plan. No, we already have a plan, right? So we need to move as strategically, as tactically, as intentionally, because we understand we are battling burnout. We're battling the state. We're battling finite resources. We have to be as intentional on the front end with the folks who have the capacity for that as possible.
So I think it's important to name that the things that we're talking about are being developed within the context of nationalism and building a peoplehood. Yeah. So when Kristina's saying like, well, we're not leaning into coalition work, that is specifically because at this time we're understanding coalition work is most effective when the different components of the coalition have strong ideological and strong practical identity. And so how can 401 do that for itself and work within the context of literal Black nationalism? So 401, we are attempting to develop a nation kind of within the tradition of the Republic of New Africa, right? We're wanting to carve out physical space and carve out ideological space and figure out who we are as a group of Black people trying to practice communism, and how can we make a life around that ideology. And so the infrastructure that we've spent the past 4 years developing are what is undergirding that peoplehood. The different collectives within 401 itself. 401 is a coalition itself. It's a federation itself. Yes. And so we're leveraging different tactical identities. One of the things that we observed was how people engage movement work. There's a diversity of tactics. There's a diversity of orientations. And so when we're talking about materialism and observing natural phenomenon and incorporating that in our practice, that's what we try to do with the structure that we have. MOC collective, L1 collective, L2 collective, L3 collective, L4 collective. So we talk about, back to your question about the Texas landscape, we didn't see that happening. We didn't see ecological movement work happening. We saw toxic tribalism, right? And tribalism doesn't have to be toxic, in our opinion, if it is intentionally connected and intentionally ecological. And that's what Kristina is describing. So our relationships with people outside of 401 are going to exist, but they're going to be more informal because we need to formalize our own internal connectivity so that we can be strong allies, strong tribal allies to other Black nationalist and Pan-Africanist and communist collectives.
So the way you're describing your relationships to other organizations is very similar to the chapter in the book Black Power by Stokely Carmichael and Charles B. Hamilton, where they talk about the myth of coalition.
Yes.
And say it is, and assert one of the, I think they do 5 assertions of coalitions or myths about coalition. And one of them is you cannot have a coalition between a group that is economically and socially secure and a group that is economically and socially insecure.
Yes.
And you can't have a coalition for wealthy white people, for example, and poor Black people, because they are not operating in the same worlds. And you can't have a coalition with a highly organized, well-funded organization on one hand and a barely holding it together and poorly funded because all the organization on the other, because all the poorly funded, barely holding it together organization can do is follow orders in that kind of coalition. But that sounds a lot like what you're saying is that before we can enter into a coalition space, we need to have our own act together and have a certain level of, and that's an important organizational principle, I think.
Yeah. Thank you so much for bringing that up, because you can see that mirrored in how we have built our allies, right? We made a decision under Njera's movement theory. Okay, we can't just be in coalition or in allyship with white people or people of color, or people resisting colonization is what we term people who traditionally are named POC. We have to build those relationships, right? Because exactly what you're saying, that power dynamic and that inequity is only going to allow the person who doesn't have the resources, doesn't have the capacity to just really follow. So those relationships have to be built internally, intentionally, and also with equity centered, right? So we do have relationships within the Federation with people resisting colonization under the banner CREAM, which is capitalism is ruining everything. And for white people.
Great repurposing of culture, by the way.
Yes, thank you. And for white people, under the banner of the allyship, and the allyship is really just a reparations corps, and it allows white folks to accurately position themselves within the Federation in alignment with Black revolutionary struggle. Right now, the only thing that you can do is pay reparations, redistribute your wealth. And for people who are resisting colonization, their orientation is building a solidarity economy and becoming trade partners so they eventually can have the resources to build something like 401 for themselves, right? So that they can have their power. And again, we can align the power dynamic between the two of us, and we can actually truly be allies because you have your stuff together, as you said, and we have our stuff together.
I think another important thing to talk about is the macro and micro aspects of what you pointed out, Max, about that chapter in Kwame Ture's book. How can a secure entity be in coalition with an insecure entity? And we've realized that even within the context of how individuals show up in a vanguard or in a formation. 401 is a vanguardist federation. And so there's this process of developing capacity that we have to go through, because in a vanguard or in an intentional living community, it's very difficult to build trust, to create restorative practices, to establish equity when people are not on a level playing field in that way, spiritually, emotionally, psychologically, economically. And so there's this kind of leveling process that we also have to move through, even as we're onboarding individuals to the different collectives within 401. And that's taken up a lot of our time and capacity over these past few years.
So I think that's been an important part for me, reading through your materials, the materials of 401, you're publicly struggling with, I don't know if you're struggling with it internally, but certainly laying to bear your position, but also understanding that the position has a certain either public perception or you're struggling parts of it. A lot of people now, I think, are thinking as there's a popular nomenclature, popular ideas around how we want flat organizations where everyone's on the same level, there's no leadership. And with saying that without acknowledging that people coming into this organization are coming in with different levels of skills. And so having it in the same way that we talk about, you can't have a coalition with rich white people and poor Black people in the same coalition. You can imagine how you could have an organization where you have some people in the organization with a lot of skills and they went to college, and other people in the same organizations who haven't, because of oppression and exploitation, haven't been taught to read and do not have many experiences outside of their own community or organized. To expect both of them to be on the same team who are making decisions about the direction. How are both of them going to have a discussion about budgets, for example, if one has never seen a budget? So I think just you're struggling with that or dealing with that is extremely, and doing so in a public way, to me, is some of the more important work that we should be doing so that other groups other organizations can learn from it. I think that's really, really critical. And I think other organizations will learn a lot from that. At least that's my hope. I certainly learned a lot from the way you've been talking about it publicly, at least on your website. There's a little more to say there, but I want to go on to a couple other things. You describe 401 as the world's first Black cooperative federation. Obvious question. What is a Black cooperative federation, and what is the role of such a formation inside of the Black liberation movement?
This is a great question. So I think that it's important to start with what 401's movement theory actually is, which is that the primary contradiction for us to grapple with right now in terms of what is impeding the progress of the Black liberation movement is this kind of incoherence. So we believe that cohesion and impetus and ideology are going to allow us to develop the formations, the structures, the alternatives that will ultimately kind of get us over this hump.
So this is the primary contradiction, not of Black people, but of Black organizing or Black movements. Is that accurate?
Yes. So kind of going back to what Kristina mentioned about the cohesion that we saw in the age of expansion with Europe, right? So we understand how race was developed, right? Let's say we're leaning on Black Marxism, we're leaning on Cedric Robinson in this moment. We understand that capital, right, is the driving force, and economic domination is the driving force of the development of the construct of race, right? Is the driving force of imperialism, right? And so there was a coalescing around, right, that strategy, that tactic, that ideology for Europe, not just like voluntarily, obviously, but through violence, we're seeing this kind of cohering around, right? And so we contend that Pan-Africa did not respond cohesively. We weren't arranged to do so. That was not our culture. That's not how our political institutions or economic institutions were structured. So we didn't respond with the cohesion that Europe attacked with, right? And so throughout our movement, we've kind of struggled to do that from the very first slave ship, from the very first instance of colonization on the continent, right? We struggled with how can we cohere around this need for resistance? And we believe that part of that happened because immediately capitalism, slavery, colonization were underdeveloping the capacity of the Black masses to have that type of cohesion and coherence, right? So in coming to that analysis, we had to ask ourselves, what do we want to do about that, right? We were tired of approaching movement work in this fragmented way, tired of allowing political polarization to prevent us from responding to the contradiction of imperialism and its cohesion, the contradiction of capitalism and the coherence around that by the West and by the whole of the imperial core. We're tired of responding to that in a fragmented way, because understanding dialectical materialism, that is not forming a response that's going to going to flip the power dynamic in this concept of the struggle of opposites, right? So we're like, okay, we need cohesion and impetus and ideology. Now, how do we go about getting that, right? So we think vanguardism, right? We subscribe to vanguardism. We need to develop a vanguard. Why, right? Going back to the point that you just made earlier, because we have different levels of capacity within our communities. We have different levels of readiness. We have different people who are able to sacrifice more than others, right? And so there has to be some systematic way of restoring capacity, developing capacity, leveling capacity. We believe a vanguard can do that. What is the vanguard going to do that, though? And that's where the question of destabilization and the question of alternatives come in. So our primary alternative is a Black intentional living community. It's a commune where we can rehabilitate people from colonization, and our destabilization tactics are really antagonizing the relationship between Black people and harmful institutions or the systems that oppress them, right? So we are leveraging this movement theory, we're leveraging this movement strategy to bring about this coherence, right? At least within the context of our federation. So all of that to answer your question, a cooperative federation is an ecological framework, in our opinion, that combines all of the different tactics and orientations that we can see occurring naturally in our movement. So it doesn't require people to kind of assimilate to one way of organizing or to one culture of existing together. Instead, it allows space for semi-autonomous movement formations, right, that are still able to work under a centralized leadership and are still able to organize themselves according to capacity. And that's where hierarchy comes in, right? If we're organizing ourselves according to capacity, then there might be some decisions that some folks need to make as opposed to others. There might be the burden of decision making not everyone is going to want to participate in or hold, right? So a federation is a conglomeration of autonomous entities. It's a connection of autonomous entities. Now it's cooperative because of the ecological function, one feeding into another, feeding into the next, right? And there's also like an economic component of that. There's trade, there's barter, there's cooperative industry so that we're able to socialize resources within the federation and pay basic income to Vanguard members. And so that's kind of like a broad breakdown of how our cooperative federation works.
And you can see pretty much everything that we're doing. We're really striving to do it, have a theory like you had mentioned earlier, as well as a praxis around it. And we saw that this was possible through our experience together as organizers. Counterbalance and BSN were on different poles of ideology, really. Like I was leaning into reformism, leaning into, like I said, gathering, and she was leaning into autonomy, leaning into sovereignty, right? So how do we come together? And once we were able to see, we're also deeply spiritual, the magic and what we were able to alchemize using both of our energies, using both of our capacity. Okay, so again, vanguardism needs to happen, right? We need to have a Pan-Africa. We need to have a peoplehood. We need to have a nation, because if all of us were doing this, we really do have a chance to catalyze revolution. We do have a chance to being, liberating our people and actually experiencing freedom if we are able to reclaim ourselves first and foremost. And we've had a lot of struggle towards that, because also tribalism is a huge thing in the African community. All Black people are not striving for that. All Black people are not striving for revolution. All Black people don't feel oppressed right now. Some people are enacting oppression. I'm not going to say they are the oppressors, but the way their praxis is looking, it's aligning like one of an oppressor, right? So understanding, okay, tribalism doesn't, or Pan-Africanism doesn't also mean that we are putting ourselves in a situation that we're trying to reclaim every single person against their will even, right? Because that is problematic in its own way, especially when you're thinking about vanguardism, when you're thinking about capacity. You have to allow people to have free will, have their own, make their own decisions, identify their own political interests. And once you do, we identify as a nation, and our political interest is in line with revolution. We identify as revolutionaries who we don't have a choice. We are people who cannot live in this world of white supremacy, who are choosing not to, and are choosing to do something else, because that is what our spirit, and our minds and our physical are dictating to us. We are predisposed to moving in alignment with revolutionary struggle as opposed to white supremacy or assimilation.
Right. So this is, again, I find this to be a very interesting model because you're, I guess, walking the line in some ways between two traditional organizing models, one being the network model, which I think is predominant now, where you have independent organizations who are together. It's a coalition, really, who are together over certain things or work together in certain areas. So, call that network or coalition model. And then the other one would be a centralized model where you have one organization that's spinning off local chapters or creating local chapters. And those local chapters are of course local chapters, but they are part of the broader. So they're not really autonomous in that direct. I guess in some respects they're autonomous because they're working on their own. But you have walked in some ways are walking the line because these units that you're talking about are autonomous and semi-autonomous, as you call it, and cover different areas, not geographical areas, if I understand correctly, but maybe some would deal with economic questions, other would deal with social questions, other would deal with other. Do these semi-autonomous elements of the Black Cooperative Federation, are they all started from the center? Or can they exist separately and then join the federation? Of course, then becoming subsuming their own independence and becoming semi-autonomous rather than independent. Or do you need to start them all your own in order to maintain ideological clarity and deliberateness?
We've learned to start at the center. Mm-hmm. We experimented at the beginning with, can we bring on autonomous formations and connect in this way? And we found practically that doesn't work or wasn't working for us. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, everyone that's in the vanguard the vanguard is comprised of 5 of these different collectives. They are going through an orientation process, a study process, a living together process in order to be able to move as a vanguard, even within each of their different missions. We don't really focus on different aspects. We don't have each collective focus on a different issue, I guess I should say. We try to have a coherent view of the holistic issue, but we have each collective respond to that issue in a different way that's according to the ecology. So L4s are focusing on really grassroots engagement. They're meeting people where they are, block walking, community gathering events, doing all of that around, let's say we're talking about Black liberation in general, but let's say the whole federation is focusing on climate change for this campaign. Mm-hmm. That's what they're doing in contribution to the campaign, so right?
L4, and you have these identified as L1, L2, L3, L4. Then L4 would do more of the grassroots work, but L2 would be doing more of the analysis, for example.
Mm-hmm. L2s kind of procedurize the praxis of everyone. And so they don't have like an external praxis. They have more of an internal praxis where they observe, the L4s did this when they were canvassing, and we need to tweak this way so that we can capture more data or so that they can actually be more responsive to the needs of the community. Mm-hmm. That's how that works. Yeah. So yes, to answer your question, within the vanguard, everyone's brought through the same core and they coalesce around a common mission. So there's that cohesion and impetus and ideology. With the social clubs, it's a little bit different. Everybody kind of comes in and they're oriented also, but it's a less intense experience. So they're kind of coalescing around the vanguard and remaining in connection with the vanguard. And the vanguard is facilitating programming for them, creating the infrastructure for the cooperative aspects of the social clubs, right? But those are the social clubs are one of the most decentralized, the least hierarchical spaces internally within the Federation.
And so you have a vanguard properly so in 401, but then also is this accurate then to say that the social clubs are the mass component of the organization?
Yes,
exactly.
Yes,
exactly.
Yeah, because understanding that, again, we have to build each and every component that we want to try to leverage for within our movement theory. So we have the masses. We know that we need a place where folks who are less restricted in terms of what they have to contribute to Black revolutionary struggles, contribute to our fight. okay, you have a little bit more space. We just need you to show up and participate in this really, minimal way. You're getting a lot of benefit and experiences. As Njera said, the Vanguard is facilitating things for you so that eventually your capacity is being regenerated. You're also seeing because you're in connection and true relationship with the Vanguard, you're seeing what's happening as a result of their actions. Mm-hmm. And then eventually you want to join the Vanguard. Mm-hmm.
You are having. So it is also an entryway potentially where you can
and that's why that's why it's so important that you said the masses, because we understand that the folks who identify what we identify as the masses, they have less capacity than the folks who are able to join the Vanguard. Folks
and just to be clear, it's less capacity because of capitalism, because of white supremacy, because of patriarchy, not because we are
inherently
absolutely right. It's because we have to identify that folks are being impacted by white supremacy in many different ways. Like you're saying, folks have real legitimate needs. Some people have kids, some people have disabilities, some people have not been exposed to information, all these things, right? And we have to make sure that we're creating an ecological response to that is within equity and allows them to whatever capacity you do have, leverage that towards revolutionary struggle in this way. And then we're also committed to, as a Vanguard, building your capacity. That's our responsibility for the people who do have the capacity, because they're not as, held down by white supremacy for whatever reason. You now are in servitude to the masses. You need to make sure that you're facilitating experiences for them. You're leveraging the money that you're bringing in as a cooperative that goes to them, right? So that we're not creating like a talented Tim situation. We're not creating elitism. We're making sure that whatever capacity, as we believe our ancestors wanted, that we are gaining as a people over time, that's going right back to the people who are being most impacted.
Also, we're learning, like with the shifting material condition, that this line between like the lumpen proletariat or the incapacitated Black masses and the Vanguard or the folks who have the capacity for revolutionary struggle is softer than what we originally thought. The distinction is not this hard, static thing. It's something that shifts and is fluid. And so we need a structure that like creates space for that fluidity. And so with the commune and with the social clubs, people are kind of able to slide in and out, right? If someone joins the Vanguard and they're like, okay, really, I'm struggling. Cool. I can live at the commune and be still developed. I'm not just like abandoned here in terms of my development to just benefit, but I still have an opportunity to contribute from where I am and to receive from where I am. So we're still trying to perfect that fluidity, and those two structures are a part of our ability to do that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, good on for trying to perfect the fluidity. It's a lifelong struggle. But so here again, this is where I find it really interesting and refreshing. Njera, you talked about perfecting fluidity. So just say, look, we're struggling with this,
right?
And Kristina, you talked about how you're not the talented 10th, even though in terms of vanguardism, one of the critiques of it has been it's very talented 10th-like. And of course, talented 10th is the theory that was forwarded by W.E.B. Du Bois, that there's a 10% of the Black population that is talented and they have a responsibility basically to lead the race, which was very elitist. He was extremely privileged, certainly at the time. He would be privileged now, but he was certainly at the time. And so I think both recognizing I really appreciate the way that you're both recognizing the similarities between vanguardism and the talented 10th. And at the same time, you are criticizing the limitations of the talented 10th and trying to just struggling to perfect over time the differences between the two, sharpen the differences between the two. I just find it amazing that you are able to talk about this publicly, I don't think enough organizations talk about the way they're struggling through some really important issues. I'm very appreciative of that work.
Thank you for understanding that. And also, it's through praxis, because we didn't start there, right? We wanted to have more of a decentralized model, but we understood we just could not get past the capacity issue. And that's where you're trying to combine your idealism with like what our principles are and what we want to get to. We want to certainly move towards a society where we don't have hierarchy, right? But what are we dealing with right now? We're dealing with a situation where people don't have the capacity to commit to being a full-time revolutionary. And what do we do about that if we understand a vanguard is necessary? necessary. Studying history, when there's been a revolution, there's been a vanguard. That's just something that we have to take as a fact, right? So now we're moving with that understanding, acknowledging the work of our ancestors, building on their shoulders. Looks like, okay, that worked. And how can we make sure that that is equitable? How can we make sure that we're not continuing to subjugate people who haven't got there or don't have the resources really to get there yet? We are making sure that we provide the resources.
I think it's important for us to acknowledge too, across the movement, how oftentimes vanguardism will happen anyway, right? So in decentralized, so-called like decentralized movements, there's not a strong like organizing of the labor, right? The contributions to the struggle or the movement. And so it falls on one person or 5 people or 10 people. And then there's a lot of conflict. There's a lot of interpersonal harm that comes from
because we're not even acknowledging that it's there. We're just
exactly.
doing more work. Those of us who are taking on more work are saying, why aren't you doing more work?
Exactly.
And also moving away from a culture. We haven't gotten really deep into that, but trying to build a new culture, right? So because you contribute more, does that mean that you have more money, right? You get more resources from the cooperative industries because we have an economic function? No. Does it mean that you have more status? No. It means that you just have more responsibility. That's it, right? And actually the resources that are divvied up in terms of like quote unquote money actually goes on an equitable scale to the people who most need it, right? So maybe you didn't contribute the most hours, and often that's our, experiences that we are putting as MOCs. That's also our promise to people that we're bringing through this process. We're putting in the most labor. We're putting in the most resources than anybody, but we don't get the most back, right? We didn't have an institution where we were able to live for free and eat for free. And that's the experience of our Vanguard members now. We had to kind of make that for them, right? And that's what we are wanting them to do for the people behind them. You have a responsibility for the people who aren't there yet to build the infrastructure to get them to the point that you're now at.
Yeah. And also thinking about social capital. So in this movement, we've always had charismatic leaderships. And we talk about like, oh, well, you're not going to have any specific status like within 401, for example, because this is the way that you show up. But we need to start acknowledging the intangible ways that people benefit and what kind of equity measures or interventions are we developing around that. So if you have high visibility in a way that affords you a lot of social capital that translates to tangible capital or resource, how are we as Ministers of Cohesion or as a Vanguard expecting you to leverage that? And for us, it's you are going to get on the front lines of tactical engagement.
Yeah.
Right. If you are, kind of developing this like pseudo celebrity or celebrity adjacent status, great. You can be an inspiration to people on the front lines. If in terms of wealth, in terms of capacity, you have all of that, then that means you have a responsibility to be kind of taking some of the higher risk there. And that's been our praxis as individuals, even before we were in 401. And so that kind of like de-incentivizes this like rush toward visibility and this rush toward celebrity within the movement. If people understand that that's going to also come with deep responsibility and deep sacrifice.
Yeah, I hear that. And I think that makes sense. Question one is, do people always get what deeper responsibility means? Or do they think, oh, great, this means higher profile? And then I'm thinking that in one particular respect, which was actually the question that I had, which was inside of the Vanguard then, particularly as it relates to the mass, if we're talking about quasi-celebrity, then you can have these other layers that exist in terms of charismatic leadership, where men get a disproportionate amount of the leadership label, and women who are every bit as charismatic and certainly every bit as competent and get the bossy label for engaging in the exact same work and the exact same behaviors, et cetera. So how are you able to, first of all, are you a women-only formation? And then how are you able to, if not, if so, then does that have anything to do with your decision? If not, then how are you able to mitigate the idea that given the indoctrination of the masses, there's a good number of people who want to follow men because they think, just like there's a good number of people who want to follow white people rather instead of Black people. How are you able to deal with or confront that?
We're not a gender specific Vanguard, but what we have seen practically is that out of the 75 plus people that we've had come through the Vanguard orientation program, only a handful of them have identified as cisgender men. And so we don't have a lot of men in our formation. And it is actually the case that a lot of the men who have volunteered for 401's vanguardism have already kind of approached it with the understanding that there needed to be equity around how they engaged with other genders. But I think it's really perceptive that you asked the question that you did, because we have had external criticism about 401 not being male or cis man centric enough, right? We've been told that we don't holistically represent the Black community because there isn't strong enough Black man representation within our vanguard. And that's something that was just completely material. I'm sure there are reasons for that, but it was not an intentional decision that we made. And so when you say, how do we resist that? We try to confront it head on and really interrogate what is the reason that cis Black men are not interested in working with or under Black women, Black gender non-conforming leadership, right? And that's something that we've not been able to really struggle with in a public forum. We hope to do that soon. These conversations have kind of happened more, ad hoc. Yeah.
Well, I'm looking forward to that conversation.
I mean, and it definitely impacts our own practice as ministers of cohesion, because I really, we've talked about this a lot, I really believe that if we were men, we would have more people and more success, traditional quote unquote success, because people have that indoctrination and are more willing often to follow people they perceive as men. But we, again, also are working with a dichotomy of gender, right? Because I identify as a masculine woman, right? And we have folks who identify as non-binary people in our vanguard. So also trying to move away from that dichotomy and allow for the expansiveness of gender, because that's another oppressive construct that's been imposed on us. And I think that also in some ways is a deterrent to some people who traditionally would be attracted to this type of work and identify as cisgendered men. I think there's a lot of work for us to do, as you mentioned, in a public forum, to struggle around gender, around hierarchy, around leadership in this way, because I think we are seeing materially, as Njera said, that there are not a lot of Black cis men in this work right now even. So what does that mean for our movement? Why is that even? What are the capacity, different levels of capacity that we're dealing with as it comes to gender? So I think there are a lot of questions that we don't have answers for, but we're looking forward to struggling towards.
I think something that Kristina is speaking to, the complex nature of the relationship between privilege and capacity and marginalization and incapacity. It's just not this strong dichotomy that I think we previously thought it was, or that it's not this dichotomy that people refer to it as. Like when we're talking about how the experience that Black men are having and what they're expressing that they feel they're experiencing and what we can see that they're experiencing. It's very complicated to try to hold both of these like identities of marginalized and oppressing, right? And that's not just within the context of gender, that's in many contexts, but I think that's what we're kind of grappling with now, especially culturally with this whole like red pill movement and all of that. It's a lot to try to grapple with.
It's a lot at one time. Yes. I've been reading through your website and some other organizational documents, your writings in other places, which I'm just thrilled with and have not been able to put down. And anyone who's like a movement or theory nerd would really get off on some of the which I am, and I've really enjoyed them. But your organizational documents talk about building autonomous zones. So can you define for us, please, what an autonomous zone is, why they're important? And have you been successful? And you're saying, we should be building autonomous zones. A lot of, people say that. Have you been successful in either building or attempting to build autonomous zones?
So the way that we're interpreting autonomous zones is spaces where the Black masses are able to control the institutions that are distributing the resources that they need, are able to practice self-determination, are able to develop an autonomous culture around liberation and peoplehood. In terms of whether or not we've been successful, so we took a crack at this last year in 2021, we established Orisha Land. Orisha Land was an autonomous zone that we established in response to the murder of Jordan Walton, who was a 21-year-old man who was murdered by Austin Police Department while experiencing a mental health crisis. It just so happened that this all happened around the same time of Texas's deadly winter storm. So Orisha Land became not only a center of cultural resistance and political resistance to police violence, but also a hub for economic equity in a time where the government, the state, the city's infrastructure was not holding up to the weight of the natural disaster caused by climate change. So during this time, we were out there. We held Orisha Land for 30 days. We distributed reparations to all of the Black people in Orisha Land, which was an 11-mile perimeter. So we carved out
right outside of Austin. Is that right? 11-mile perimeter.
In Austin,
Okay.
in East Austin. Yeah. So East Austin is historically Black, right? It is the most gentrified area in Austin. So a lot of Black people have been displaced from the part of Austin that is east of I-35. And the area that we carved out actually was where at one time the highest concentration of Black people lived. So we used a car caravan and a on-foot march that was followed by a car caravan to carve out this zone and declare this an autonomous space for Black people. The capital of this zone was Jordan's Place. And Jordan's Place is centered in Rosewood Park, which is actually the first park in Austin where Black people were able to legally gather. It was actually given to Black people after the first park where Black people were allowed to gather was seized by the city and used for something else.
Well, we were given access to it. We weren't given it.
Right. We were given access to it. Sure. Mm-hmm. And it's important. Language is important. So I feel you. So we decided to take up space in this way. And we wanted to do this because we felt that this was an opportunity for us to demonstrate to folks the power of vanguardism and cohesive movement work, and also a way for us to propagandize the utility of autonomy and self-determination. We wanted to propagandize a rejection of reform and kind of reliance on the state to meet our resources. We wanted to propagandize the state's failure in this moment. And so we kind of did that by distributing reparations to all the Black families in the zone during this winter storm, distributing food and water to all the Black families in the zone and outside of the zone while infrastructure was down. So people didn't have access to water in their homes. People were really struggling to eat as all of the grocery stores were closed. People really couldn't get out to venture around the city or the state to find stores that were open because the roads were literally iced over and so dangerous. And so we as a vanguard were able to position ourselves as a socialist alternative to the state by distributing these resources to folks and letting them know that this was an area that we were holding and keeping the police outside of. Almost immediately, we were pushed back and reduced to Jordan's Place. And so the zone, the heart of the zone became most of the zone for probably at least 20 days of the occupation itself. And so there was a lot that we experienced and were able to do. We were able to kind of plant a food forest. We were able to plant flower gardens in front of bell canvas tents. We were able to provide housing. We were able to develop food sovereignty initiatives through community gardening and community farming within the zone. We were able to develop community defense and community public safety initiatives by having planned watches within our zone. We were able to develop restorative responses to interpersonal harm within the zone. We were able to grapple with autonomous solutions to mental health crises within the zone. And so it was a really holistic experience and an opportunity for us to demonstrate to our community what is possible outside of the context of organizing within the state or in relationship to the state, or what is possible outside of reformist efforts. We were really able to demonstrate the utility of the vanguard. We were really able to demonstrate the utility of alternatives. And we were also able to kind of create a more polarizing environment for the state, right? As people were feeling endeared to this zone because of the resources that we were distributing at the time, the question arose, well, why can't it stay? Well, what is the issue? This park was gentrified anyway. This space is supposed to be ours anyway. So we felt that we really were able to kind of hold down a more populist rallying point for the community in a way that, to be honest, we've struggled with as our politics feel really foreign to a lot of the folks that we engage usually. This was something that was tangible. It made all of our politics kind of visible and palpable in the moment.
Well, it turned your theory and ideology into actual politics that people could grapple with and deal with and kind of, touch in some way, because your theory then resulted in people getting food when the day before they didn't have access to food. And some people actually had housing, right? You provided tents for otherwise unhoused people. So this is amazing. Just a point on language, since we're both interested in doing the language thing. So as you describe this as an autonomous zone, would you... And I get the importance of crafting language in a way that makes sense for you and in a way that it advances your own. Is this the same way that most of us would understand community control, the language that the Panthers used or is used in other contexts today?
So the reason that we don't use community control specifically is that sometimes it refers to community control of institutions developed by the state. And we really want to encourage the masses and to, as a vanguard, develop public alternatives to those institutions rather than kind of taking over those institutions. So when we talk about control of the police, that's not something that we're interested in, right? When we talk about control of the city's budgeting process, for example, we actually want to liberate those funds and practice control of those funds as a community outside of that city or state institution. And so that's why we use that specific language as opposed to community control. I also think, I really appreciate you bringing this up. I think there's a little bit of a distinction between an autonomous zone and a liberated zone as well. And we're still kind of grappling with that and thinking through that. And one of the things that we really want to be careful about is not positioning something that is an intervention or a step toward liberation as the final destination. And we found through our practical engagement of folks on the ground that it's very easy for us to be like, oh, community control, we're going to win it and we're going to be free. Oh, autonomous zone, it's going to be liberated land, liberated institutions, or liberated resources, and we're going to be free. So we've tried to avoid using language that speaks to some kind of conclusion. We've made it, we're liberated, and kind of try to speak more to the essence of the thing. So this was an opportunity.
Present that language as a vision. In other words, you say, we are fighting for an autonomous zone, but what we actually want is a liberated zone, and then define that.
We do present our vision, but I think it's important for me to clarify that 401's vision is a Black nation of Orishans, right? So we identify as Orishans, right? We identify as Black people who are struggling toward displaced Africans, right? Who are struggling toward a sovereignty that we do not have access to on the basis of any nationality that we currently hold. So we are not Americans. We are not interested in American citizenship. We are not interested in, a permanent state of autonomy within American citizenship. We are interested in a sovereignty, in a literal nationalism that we can leverage to help the entire diaspora push toward Pan-Africanism, right? And so when we present our vision, We talk more to our L3s, our intentional living communities, which are actually separate from the autonomous zones that we fight for. So the intentional living communities are on land that we obtain not necessarily through struggle, right? We might purchase the land, we might be given the land, right? But it's not, those are spaces that we keep separate from the destabilization tactic that we engage to antagonize the relationship between the Black masses and systems of oppression. The autonomous zones are a destabilization for us.
We're going to use that autonomous zone, the placing of it, the institution that it attacks most directly, to antagonize the relationship between the masses and the spaces where we're establishing this zone and the institutions that we're developing alternatives to through the zone. But that is kind of like a middle point for the folks that we're trying to radicalize and pull into movement work, right? Actually, what we're hoping is going to happen from there is they're going to join the vanguard, or they're going to go to the more permanent intentional living communities that we have as 401. So there's a difference between our autonomous zones and our communes, right? The autonomous zones are a place for us to temporarily make palpable our politic and our movement theory so that the masses can engage that in a way that is completely accessible and not like only within a theoretical context, just like you said earlier, Max, right? And then once we're able to recruit the folks we're able to either the vanguard or the commune, we're able to develop those folks more intensely and respond to their needs more intensely and permanently. Those communes that we're describing are what we're actually hoping are going to develop into our physical nation, right? And so the struggle that we're anticipating is one that will be a struggle for land and will be a struggle for sovereignty around those communes more intensely than the struggle within the autonomous zones. Now, one of the tactical pivots or shifts that we've incorporated is we want folks, because we've come to understand how tribal Black people and African people actually are, leaving space for the folks who don't want to assimilate to a vanguard or don't want to engage movement work in this a particular way to still hold that autonomous zone. So we're trying to hold ourselves to responsible as a vanguard for leaving infrastructure that can continue to be held and populated by the people of the locale where the autonomous zone was established, even if they don't see a future for themselves in vanguardism or in radical communal living or in Black nationalism, et cetera.
Again, really, really interesting and well delineated thought. And I just am appreciating the ways that it calls certainly the Leninist idea of dual powers, saying that we need to be creating these dual powers that compete with the dominant and oppressive state in order to draw people's attention. And then that idea was further developed and I think better developed certainly by Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of the freed Ghana, although he talked about dual powers in the context of creating contested zones. And then ultimately those contested zones would result in liberated zones. But that context was completely different because that was happening on the continent in Ghana, where so those liberated zones exist differently than we would talk about liberated zones in colonized land that has been stolen. So it'd be a very, very different way of thinking about it. But I think it is very similar in some ways, and I get the distinctions that you're making, but very similar in some ways with the community control that the Panthers were looking for, in the respect that they were trying to create dual powers. And you saw this with the school breakfast program in a way that would endear the community towards the organization and towards the alternative systems, right? So then people would say, okay, why am I paying taxes to a government that is oppressing us and not providing breakfast for my child when I have an organization here who is not oppressing us, is actually trying to free us, and they are providing breakfast to my child and to my children.
Exactly. Thank you for that context. And I think that for us, the experience has been, folks are endeared to the alternatives, but I don't think, so for example, Orisha land, we were able to hold for 30 days. I don't think that was long enough to be able to really maximize the benefit to the community or maximize the invest divest behavior that we're trying to catalyze through the destabilization. So right now, what we're struggling with is, what were the failures of Orisha Land and Marshall the Block? How could we have held this for longer? And that's actually part of the reason why we incorporated the social clubs. So the social clubs are one of the newest additions to the Federation. We always had this conceptualization of social blocks that would be managed, inspired, mobilized by the L1 collective. And we were able to finally manifest that in the form of the social clubs, right? So we kind of need to develop our own masses, right? We need to understand where are the masses already primed to kind of mobilize around this concept of an autonomous zone, and where are we going to kind of be coming in cold. We never come in completely cold, because the L4 collective is actually supposed to go and do groundwork, right? Be canvassing, be hosting community events, be in deep communication and relationship to the folks who are living in this area before we just show up and try to establish a autonomous zone, right? But also, you can't really put a time limit, or can't anticipate how much time that type of relationship building takes. So we can say the L4s are going to be on the ground doing this work for a year, or 2 years before we try to establish an autonomous zone here. But the relationships are going to be built on their own time. And so that also means that we need ongoing relationships with blocks of who we identify as the masses of the lumpen proletariat, who are going to be poised to offer that community support within context, right? To supplement that work that the L4 collective is doing on the ground. That's one of the pivots or the shifts that we're making to try to prolong the amount of time that we're able to hold a zone and do the work with the folks who are local to that area.
Got it. Well, I'm certainly looking forward to the update when you've held a zone for a year, and you can update us on what the material consequence was to holding it a year versus holding it for 30 days, and with the addition of the social aspect. All right. So how can people learn more about 401, and how can people support your work and all the projects they're in, all the federations they're in, and how can people support that kind of work?
So to learn more about 401, I would recommend visiting our website, www.401.com.
And that's spelled out, right? That's not 401. It's spelled out.
Thank you. It's phonetic. It's not numerical. Thanks for that clarification. Yeah. So it's 401, all spelled out. And I also recommend following us on Instagram. We have a lot of resources kind of streamlined for folks' access there. So that would be 400 and AND 1, the number 1 on Instagram. And there you'll find our manifesto. You'll find communiques that we've published about the different campaigns that we've launched over the past 4 years. You'll find a lot about Orisha Land and what we did, the campaign that we launched to try to see or inspire a resurgence in support for Orisha Land after the winter storm was over. In terms of how folks can support, we always tell people, please find a space in the ecology that resonates with you or that matches the capacity that you have for contribution in this moment. So you can apply for the Vanguard both at our website and by visiting our Instagram, just so that folks know we offer free housing to Vanguard members. Vanguard members receive a basic income every month. They receive free food and subsidized healthcare, so that we can try to expand all of our capacity for vanguardism. If you're not ready for that, please do apply for one of our social clubs, and you can find those listed on our website and on the Instagram page in our link tree. And also, you can support us by remaining vigilant. I think that there's something that is happening. We're seeing a lot of fascism on social media. We're seeing a lot of repression of revolutionary voices, revolutionary formations. So it's going to take more than just kind of passively engaging with organizations to be able to stay up to date with what they're doing. So please do intentionally follow us. You can subscribe to our email newsletter at our website, and that's the way to really get in-depth information about what we're doing at any given time. Yeah, those are the things that I can think of in this moment.
Great. So, Njera Keith, thank you so much for your time and for your work. And please extend our thanks as well to your comrade, Kristina Brown, and for the work both of you are doing with 401.
Thank you.
Okay, that's our show. Thank you for listening to The Next World. I'm Max Rameau. You can find out more about my work at pacapower.org. That's PACA power.org. You can read more in depth on many of the issues we talked about today on the Partners for Dignity and Rights website, dignityandrights.org. That's dignityandrights.org. We'll be back with another episode of The Next World soon. Until then, please tell your friends about us and help us spread the word about this podcast. Goodbye for now, and remember, organize, organize, organize.